In this video, I'm going to be discussing a bit about the philosophy of self and why discussing the philosophy of self and developing understanding in one's own philosophy of self is important. And then there's three essential problems essentially to the philosophy of self and which pretty much define the investigation of the philosophy of self. And that's the nature of self and whether or not there is a self at all. As well as whether or not we can know the self, if there is a self. So these three questions, the nature of self, what is the nature of self, is there a self, and can we know the self, are all very important to understanding the philosophy of self. And when it comes to developing an understanding of the philosophy of self and engaging in a history of the ideas of the philosophy of self, it really helps and goes hand in hand with supporting our own understanding of our well-being and the various aspects of the self that promote greater well-being. And in early philosophy, such as Aristotle's philosophy of the soul, it pertains directly to the self and notions of the self. He viewed other questions that are very important to the philosophy of self that we can go about in terms of addressing these questions, and that was whether or not we were to view the self as a whole or composed of these parts and these component parts. And we often see in personality psychology and personality research, this is how often we go about studying personality. There are these overarching personality characteristics or traits that have various aspects and components to them that allow us to learn more about the intricacies of our unique characteristics that separate us from other individuals, such as our various feelings, our emotions, and our thought patterns, and how these form these larger top level traits like trait openness to experience or conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, disagreeableness, and emotional stability. These are overarching traits that have corresponding individual level processes or parts, and this is very much analogous to these central problems with the philosophy of self. The self has a whole, this larger object that we seemingly use to characterize it or characterize the self in regards to these ideas of individuality and characteristics that are expressed uniquely by individuals and which have personality correlates but which are not quite the same as the self, and which there are aspects and thoughts that are related to the self that are distinct from others but which aren't quite the self, and these have more to do with the component potential aspects of the self or component parts of the self that characterize the self. And I would claim that these components and parts are very important to understanding what I call self-actualization tendencies that take us and express more of these authentic forms of living and authentic in relation to the self and its infusement with perceptions, motivations, emotions, feelings, actions, and behaviors, which are ultimately components of the self and which have component processes associated with various expressions of personality and personality characteristics, as well as situated characteristics that can come to form continuous aspects of the self. And when it comes to answering questions about in regards to what is the nature of the self, it's important to understand that there are these two separate interests that a lot of philosophers have who've studied the self, and then that's a direct philosophy that's truly interested in understanding the perceptual and empirical and embodied nature of the self, rather than have any interest in discussing the optimization or the health of the self in particular, or its well-being and its welfare, but rather its nature, how the self is in reality and in relation to existence. And these are very, very important for the second major concern with regards to the philosophy of self, and that's ultimately how do we live a good life in regards to the self, and how do we live a meaningful life, and this well-being focus of the self. So we could think of it as a problem to do with the nature of self and a problem to do with the well-being of the self and how the self impacts well-being. And these are different ways to approach a philosophy of the self. And ultimately, they are two sides of the same coin. So often when we go to address one of these, we're addressing the second simultaneously. But there's often some splintering off during the philosophizing process, in which sometimes there's more of a focus on the nature of self rather than what in the moment improves the quality of being or the quality of one's existence, and what reduces suffering in the nature of self and existence. But at other moments, we're more concerned with questions of what it means to live a good life, and often when we're exploring questions of what's meaningful, that directly involves what's meaningful to the self and what's also meaningful in regards to these very situated characteristics that pertain to the self, and the situated self in particular. And when we're addressing the philosophy of self, it's important to understand both of those and to address them appropriately in the various conditions and situations that would require us to do so. So when we're looking more at, say, the structures or the parts of self, this more has to do with the nature of self. But when we're interested in understanding whether or not the self contributes to optimal living, this has more to do with what it means to live a good life and the nature of the positive self, and how our unique virtues and strengths impact our well-being and what's uniquely meaningful to us as individuals. This is a different matter in regards to the nature of self. And there are various responses and ways we can go about approaching this that fall under explorations of two various questions that I'll elaborate in further videos, and that's whether or not there is a self at all, because some traditions and philosophers have thought that it's actually the self itself that brings about suffering, though I have a tendency to disagree with this, and there's a lot of philosophers and discussion even internally within those criticisms of the self that will use the self in relation to responding to questions of what it means to live a good life, and particularly in relation to, well, what's meaningful in life. Well, the self is what makes things meaningful and invigorates the life with meaning. So there's a little bit of these contradictions that you'll see when it comes to understanding this idea of no self. And I think it's more focused on ideas of altruism and selflessness rather than it is about there actually being no self and no sense of individuality or individuation. And it's more about a focus on detachment rather than and criticizing attachments rather than understanding self-acceptance and self-compassion, which are major pillars to living well and to being well, and which directly require a recognition of the self. And it's through this recognition of the self that we can often transcend suffering, not removal from it or an illusion from it or denying it. In fact, how often denying and neglecting the self can produce detriment and ill well-being at the expense of what we find meaningful and what we value, in favor often for, sometimes it's appeasing others or to present ourselves in a more favorable light, which can be problematic in and of itself. So that's a very, very important question. The second important question is, if we do have a self, how can we know this self, and how can we become a more authentic self? And the question of the identity of the self, or what is the self, pertains more directly to this nature of the self. And whether or not we can know the self has much more to do with our degree of authenticity and our authentic expression, and starting to embody meaning in what's particularly meaningful in regards to the self and questions of value. So that's very, very important to the philosophy of the nature of self, and I'll be discussing this also in more videos upcoming.